Okay, welcome everybody to this Scientific Snapshot virtual seminar. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. I'm Steve Walker and I work with the National Marine Mammal Foundation. And we hold these snapshot seminars from time to time to really give people a window into the exciting work and research that's being done by the foundation. And in a minute, you're going to hear from Dr. Dorian Houser, who is the Foundation's Director of Biologic and Bioacoustic Research. He's going to discuss why it's so important to understand whale hearing so we can better protect them from ocean noise. Now, as you may know, the National Marine Mammal Foundation is a nonprofit organization recognized globally as a leader in marine mammal science, medicine, and conservation. Our team of experts is answering critical questions about the health of the world's marine mammals and our shared oceans. And our mission is really to improve and protect life for marine mammals, humans, and our shared oceans through science, service, and education. Before we begin, a couple quick housekeeping items. Dorian's presentation is going to last about 30 to 40 minutes, and he will take some questions at the end. If you do have a question, please open up the chat box and just type that into the chat box. But please make sure that you're sending it to me, Steve Walker, so I can go through them. We're going to get to as many questions as we can before this seminar ends, which is going to be at 1 o'clock. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dorian. He's studied the psychology and bioacoustics of marine mammals for more than 25 years, including various aspects of diving, fasting, and metabolic physiology, marine mammal hearing, and dolphin echolocation, and a lot more. Dorian joined the National Marine Mammal Foundation in 2010, and he is the recipient of the R. Bruce Lindsay Award from the Acoustical Society of America. So please welcome Dr. Dorian Houser.
Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. A wonderful introduction. And so as we have sufficient time to move things along, I would like to go ahead and get right into our presentation. So I'll share my screen here, and if I can just get concurrent, Steve, that you see it.
Yes, we can.
Very good. Let's go ahead and begin. Well, thank you all for being here. Appreciate that you're taking the time out of your day to do so. I am happy to take this opportunity to talk about a project that we are undertaking in Norway to attempt to measure the hearing of the minke whale. And it's part of our larger overall goal of improving and protecting life for marine mammals by understanding how ocean noise might impact them. Now, as introduction, many of you probably know that sound doesn't travel well through air. If you were on a football field, for instance, and you started yelling at your friend, the further they walked away, the sound drops off. And by the time they're at the other end of the field, it's very difficult to understand them. Well, that's not true underwater. Sound travels efficiently through water, and it's probably for this reason that marine mammals have adapted to use sound to make a living in the ocean. Indeed, for the whales and dolphins, it might be their primary sensory modality, hearing, that allows them to forage, navigate, and to coordinate mating within the ocean. So it's important for us to understand not only that underwater hearing is critical to them performing these functions, but as people who are concerned about their welfare and conservation, what their hearing abilities are, so that we might better understand how we might impact them by creating noise in the ocean. Now, the 20th century was really a period of dramatic increase in ocean noise, a lot of it due to industrialization. There are numerous sources of ocean noise, many of which have increased and continue to increase around the world. They're very diverse. Low frequency, persistent noise that comes from shipping, short-term and continuous sonar type signals, which can be tonal in nature, explosives, seismic exploration, green energy installations are even of concern, particularly when we think about the installations of windmills and the persistent low frequency noise they generate when they operate. So there are a plethora of noise sources that we as humans have introduced into the world's oceans. And it's important for us to understand just what kind of impact that might have on marine mammals. And first we need to think about, how does sound behave in the ocean? Now, I already told you that sound travels efficiently underwater. So efficiently that depending upon the frequency and the level of sound that is projected, it can travel hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. These sources may be brief or prolonged in duration, as discussed with some of those sources, and may have various frequency characteristics, maybe tonal, maybe harmonic, much like when you hear a guitar chord having different frequencies or multiples of the tonal frequency, or broadband having many frequencies at once. It's important to note, though, that the sound as it moves through the ocean is greatly affected by both the bottom of the ocean, what it's made of and its shape, as well as ocean conditions such as the temperature, the depth of the water, the salinity, and weather patterns as well. I've given an example here on the right of a ray trace of a sound that is projected just below the water surface, and you can see that the sound travels not only great distance, over 80 kilometers away from the source, but has a very dynamic behavior as it bounces up and down in the water column, off the seafloor and off the surface. It's complicated. Indeed, you can be 45 kilometers away from the source near the surface and not hear it, but 200 meters below the surface you would. So it's a complicated picture, and it's something that we need to think about too when we think about the exposures of animals to noise, particularly when we think about characteristics that could be particularly problematic, such as ducting, when the temperature is able to trap sound into a particular layer of the water column, enabling it to travel greater distances than it normally would, or reverberation, which can occur in environments where the sound can bounce back and forth between structures, say in between these two valley walls, thus causing it to persist in the environment longer than if it had traveled and dissipated. Well, with all those complex characteristics about sound, what we're really interested in is how the sound, when it is encountered by a marine mammal, can impact them. And we generally think of it as having physiological and behavioral impacts. Looking at the worst case scenario, if an animal is close enough to a sound source that it is a high enough level of sound, it can potentially cause injury. And in a lot of regulatory realms, generally the onset of that injury has been looked at as the permanent threshold shift. That is a permanent change in your hearing sensitivity. And that permanent change occurs because there has been some sort of damage to the ear, which should be the most sensitive organ to sound. Below that, the ear can be stimulated to such a level that it becomes temporarily impaired. That is, you have a shift in your ability to hear, but it's recoverable. And I think most of us who are of a certain age probably have experienced this if you have gone to a rock concert. In fact, it's called the rock concert effect. After the concert, you can't hear as well as you could going in, but generally by the next day, that ability has returned to normal. And over on the side, you'll see that there's graphics, which kind of lay these out in cartoon form. If we think of the sound source as being the point at the point of the wedge, and then moving away from the wedge, you see a decrease in the impact that the sound potentially has on an animal. Closest to the source is where we'd expect injury. Further away, that temporary shift, but then beyond that, a series of different effects that could potentially happen. These include interfering with the ability of the animal to detect sounds or discriminate sounds. You can think of this as sort of the cocktail party effect, that as noise is going on, you either don't realize that someone is talking to you, or if they are talking to you, you have difficulties understanding what they're saying. It has the potential to annoy or disturb the animals, potentially causing also a change in behavior. And in this case, we're thinking about behaviors of biological significance, such as foraging or diving. As we increase in severity, maybe even abandonment of habitat. And in the worst case scenario, possibly even stranding if the animal flees from a source that it finds frightening or a high enough level that it really tries to get away from it. Additionally, there's a physiological response called distress response, which I think most of us are familiar with in our own lives, typified by an increase in cortisol under stressful situations, but also other types of physiological responses. But there is potential then for stress to be induced by exposure to ocean noise as well. These are all sort of proximate effects. And from a welfare perspective, when we think about marine mammals, that is important for us to be concerned with. But as conservationists, we want to take then those proximate effects and try to understand how they affect things such as growth, the animal's reproductive success, or its probability of survival. These we refer to as our vital rates. And these are the things that potentially impact a population of animals. Therefore, it's important for us to understand how those proximate effects of being exposed to sound then are translated into possible changes in a population, particularly for a population that is already impacted or endangered. So when we think about our job of trying to understand how sound impacts whales, we have to start with a basic question. What frequencies of sound can a whale hear, and how sensitive are they to that sound at that frequency? This provides us the most fundamental piece of information that we need in order to predict what might happen to a whale exposed to human-caused ocean noise. Just knowing the hearing range is useful because that helps us understand what noise sources the whales can hear and which ones are potentially problematic. And if they are problematic, at what levels they might become problematic. And that we get from understanding how sensitive they are to that particular frequency of sound. So the piece of information we need to start with is a description of the frequencies of sound an animal can hear and how sensitive it is to those sounds, which when we plot that out, we call it an audiogram. Now on the screen before you is an audiogram, and on the y-axis is what we call the threshold. This is the lowest level of sound that the animal can hear. On the x-axis, we have the frequency, or we would most relate this to pitch. And in this case, we have sort of a simulated human audiogram as we have frequencies down to just below 20 hertz and up to about 20 kilohertz. Now, to understand the audiogram, you need to understand that the lower you are on the curve, the greater sensitivity you have to the sound. So in the case of human beings, the best hearing range is somewhere between maybe 2 and 5 kilohertz. But it's really good all the way down to probably a couple of hundred hertz. But it drops off rapidly above 20 kilohertz. And as most of us know, as you get older in age, where this steep uptick in the slope of the audiogram occurs starts to decrease as you get older, as you lose frequency sensitivity. So it is this information that we need to compare to the sound sources that are out there that might be exposing marine mammals to ocean noise. There are two ways for us to go about trying to collect an audiogram for a marine mammal. There's the behavioral approach, and there is the electrophysiological approach. And specifically with electrophysiological approaches, I will be talking today about the use of something called the auditory evoked potential, as it is the most common method used amongst the electrophysiological techniques. Now, behavioral audiometry is considered the gold standard. In behavioral audiometry, you need to have access to an animal and work with it through training and positive reinforcement to teach it to listen quietly to sounds that are played to it. And that when it hears a sound, it provides a behavioral response, either by touching a paddle or maybe by making a whistle in the case of dolphins or belugas. And if there is no sound, then it is to remain quiet. And by changing the levels of sound that the animal is exposed to and looking for its responses, you can then come up with an audiogram by testing across multiple frequencies. Again, this is the gold standard. Now, auditory evoked potentials offer another method of doing so, and the auditory evoked potential is a voltage that is produced by the brain when it hears a sound. Auditory evoked potentials are used regularly and clinically in humans, and every newborn, at least in the United States, is tested via auditory evoked potentials for hearing deficits soon after birth. These techniques in the last 20 years have been adapted for use in marine mammals. And you see multiple examples here with 3 different species of cetacean, as well as 1 pinniped, in this case, an adult male elephant seal. The way this is performed is by playing a sound to an animal through a transducer. In the case of the dolphin here, it's through what we call a jaw phone. And then 3 different sensors that are placed along the back, also called electrodes. But these sensors are recording the electricity that is produced by the brain. And as in turning down the sound levels into the behavioral audiometry and looking for when an animal can no longer respond to the presence of a sound, you can monitor when the brain wave disappears in response to the level of sound, and therefore come up with an estimate of the hearing sensitivity at the frequency at which you are testing. Both methods have their pros and cons, but I want to focus on one of those right now. Again, behavioral audiometry is the gold standard because it is truly an integrated response of the animal, but you need to have long-term access to animals to be able to collect those types of audiograms. For that reason, most behavioral audiograms exist are from bottlenose dolphins and belugas within the toothed whale world, and some other species as well, but they are not as well represented. Here you see a number of different audiograms for the beluga, as well as the bottlenose dolphin. And you'll note there are multiple different audiograms on here. Each one of those corresponds to a different individual, and they're not nice and smooth like what I showed you before, but this is the real world, and there is variability within and amongst individuals. Nevertheless, this is the ideal approach, but it's not practical for most species of marine mammals because most species of marine mammals are not under human care. This is where the auditory evoked potential method can come in. If you look to the right on the list, this list shows over the last 20 years the number of audiograms that have been collected using auditory evoked potential methods for different species. Of course, bottlenose dolphins lead the way with over 200 animals tested, but belugas and harbor porpoises also quite a number, particularly when compared to the number of behavioral audiograms that exist. Maybe more importantly is that you have a number of species that will never be tested any other way. Animals that are novel in our understanding of the hearing that have tested because they were in rehab as part of a stranding event. And I will point out within the United States now it has become common practice that before any toothed whale is released back to the wild from a rehabilitation event, its hearing is tested with auditory evoked potential methods to ensure that it has adequate hearing for making a living once returned to the sea. Now, the problem is, if you noticed on that last slide, there are no audiograms in existence for any baleen whale. In effect, most of what we attempt or predict as far as impacts to whales that are based upon their hearing sensitivities is guesswork to some extent, but I would say informed guesswork. There are several different ways at which we can go about trying to predict what these whales hear. One of those is based upon the anatomy of the ear. Looking at the structure of it, we can come up with models that will come up with predictions of the range of hearing of an animal, and maybe less so the sensitivity. Another method is to listen to the frequencies of sound at which the whale vocalizes. It's logical that an animal vocalizes and communicates at a frequency it can also hear. The third way is to look at behavioral reactions of animals to sounds, and this comes into 2 categories: intentional playback studies or behavioral response studies in which animals are intentionally exposed to a sound and then their behavior monitored, or incidental observations. These are things that occur when people notice the reaction of a whale in the presence of a sound source. Now, all of these can inform to some extent what a baleen whale might hear, but they each have issues. The ear anatomy approach suffers from the fact that it is a model making a prediction, and as such requires validation. Ironically, the best way to validate it is to have an audiogram to which to compare the outputs to. Frequencies at which animals vocalize provide you some information about what the frequencies an animal might hear, but many studies now have been conducted that show that animals regularly have frequency ranges of hearing that are much broader than the ranges at which they vocalize. Therefore, if you used only that, you would sorely underestimate the frequencies an animal might hear. And finally, behavioral reactions to sound. Even though we may see an animal respond to a sound, an animal may also hear a sound and not respond to it. Therefore, you have to be cautious with behavioral reactions because you, again, may underestimate the sensitivity of the animal to the sounds that it is exposed to. Which leads us to our current project. Our goal is to obtain the first audiogram for any baleen whale. And the hope is that this will become that fundamental piece of information that we can build on and looking at better estimates of the kinds of impacts human beings might have on baleen whales through their ocean noise producing activities, as well as helping the regulatory community come up with more rigorous means and bounds for the regulations that are implemented. So let me talk about the current minke whale hearing test project, which is being funded by multiple agencies: the Office of Naval Research, the Navy Living Marine Resources being the Navy partners, the National Marine Fisheries Services through NOAA, and then the Marine Mammal Commission, as well as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. All have interest in understanding what it is that these large whales hear. Well, our approach is to look at this group of large whales and pick the smallest one, the smallest species, the minke whale, Balaenoptera acutorostrata, as our target animal. Being the smallest of the mysticetes, its adolescents range in about 3 to 5 meters, which is important for the work we are trying to conduct. That length is about the same length as that of an adult beluga, so I've put to scale here over on the top right. We have performed numerous AEPs in belugas with great success, and we believe that we will have similar success with these size animals using the AEP approach. Simply put, the smaller the size of the animal, the greater the chance of success using auditory evoked potentials to measure a hearing curve. We select this animal also because adolescent minkies have a very predictable migratory path along the coastal waterways of Norway, which I'll explain a little more in a slide or two. And this is really something that allows us to approach this project and overcome obstacles that were uncovered when a similar project was acquired or was performed several years ago. Also, minke whales, based upon the observations collected, seem to respond calmly when they are in nets, and this project would require the animal to be in a net hammock. I have here on the bottom right a picture of a minke whale that has been pulled up in this net hammock, created after it swam into this fish farm, apparently foraging. In this picture, there are individuals in the water that are putting a satellite tag on the animal before it is released. Has been documented, and the animal behaved calmly throughout the procedure. We expect similar type of behavior from the animals in this test. We select the region we're working at in the coastal region of Norway because the predicted migratory pattern of the adolescent whales is through this region. And as you can see, there are many sorts of small islands that we can utilize to set up our experimental catch area. Specifically, adolescent whales have a different migratory path than do the adults or the moms with calves. If you look at the map to the right, the region that you see extending out is the area of Lofoten, which is where this project is being conducted. Adult whales typically swim north to the Arctic and pass by the fjord. Adolescents, however, swim inside the fjord and around, hugging the coastline. And at some point as they age, they take on the more adult pattern. This allows us to set up an area where we can temporarily catch an animal for performing the hearing tests. If you look at the graphic below, the area where we are conducting the work consists of 2 islands with a basin between them. The animals at this point are on a westward migration, and we are going to set up barrier nets that extend eastward. As the animals are moving westward, they encounter these nets, and that net guides them into the basin. The basin is closed off on one side by a barrier net. And when the animal swims between the islands, we pull another barrier net closed behind it. Once the animal is inside that basin, it is observed by our marine mammal veterinarians for a period of time until they decide that it is suitable for testing. The animal, once in the basin, then is going to enter a fish farm. Now, originally the idea was that we would have to take a net and slowly move it across the basin so the animal moved into the farm. However, based upon observations of our first year, the animals we found once in the basin explore for ways out of the basin to continue their migration and come up directly to the door of the fish farm. Now, based on our first season work, we did not open the fish farm door open, but on the behavior of the animals, we believe that we have a fairly good chance that if we open the door up, the animal will swim into the fish farm thinking that it is an exit from the basin. Once it's in the fish farm, the door can be pulled up quickly behind it. Now in the fish farm, the nets are loose underneath but go to the seafloor. Those nets can then be pulled up to create a hammock similar to what we see down here. If you look at the ring of the fish farm, you can see that there are hooks that occur at about every 2 meters. This allows the nets to be pulled up and hooked in a progressive fashion. In fact, it's the very same way that the fishermen pull the salmon up in the net as a group. Once that hammock is created, then we can get next to the whale, place the electrodes upon it for the recordings, and place the sound source, and then proceed with the data collection. Upon completion of that, the satellite tag will be placed upon the whale, the nets will be lowered in the fish farm, and the door opened up, and the animal released back into the basin. Once in the basin, upon approval of the veterinarians on site, the basin door is opened, allowing the animal to continue on its migration. Now, it's important, I think, at this point to address some misinformation that has been out there in the community regarding two aspects of the project. One is that to do the AEP measurements with these animals, we need to use subcutaneous electrodes. So we can't use the surface sensors like we have before, although we will try them first. We expect, because of the depth of the blubber layer, we will need to use a different type of electrode. Blubber is a poor conductor of electricity, so getting through that blubber layer, at least partially, is important to getting a good electrical signal. Now, it has been misconstrued that these electrodes are going to be deleterious to the animal, but I just want to put an image of what these electrodes look like here. This is a needle electrode. The needle electrode is about half the length of a paper clip, and its width is a 27 to 30 gauge needle, which is equivalent to an acupuncture needle. So we do not believe that the animals will even perceive these being inserted based upon some other work that we've done with larger animals such as these. We also need to point out that we have had claims that the animals will be stunned for this project. And that is possibly a misinterpretation of the fact that there is a sedation protocol in place should an animal seem that it is moving too much for the procedure to continue. And ideally, I want to point out that we do have protocols and monitoring in place to monitor the health and welfare of the animal during the process, including monitoring its heart rate, its respiration rate, and its blood work during the hearing test. If the animal is in distress and the veterinarians determine that it must be released, we can quickly release it back into the pen and then back into the basin. So the animal's welfare is of our utmost concern. Now, a little bit about this last year. This last year was really a pilot study for us to see how things would work. And it's an intensive effort, just setting up the barrier system so that we can guide the whales between the basins was an extremely involved process, requiring a special ship to deploy the nets. This required several days of effort, deploying nets that ranged in length from 50 to 600 meters and to depths of 40 to 50 meters resting on the bottom. These are weighted nets that stretch to the surface. Over the course of the deployment, we deployed nearly 2 kilometers of nets weighing over 20 tons. And many of these are attached directly to the land, so they are quite secure, or to 2-ton anchors on the bottom of the seafloor. It's an involved job that requires not only the purse seine boat, but also smaller boats that allow us to maneuver the ends of the nets and tie them off in place. We also need the assistance of the Aqua Fisheries. They are the ones who were able to provide us with a fish farm. Here you see the fish farm that is used or will be used for testing. It's 100 meters in diameter. And the fish farm is set up by the Aqua Fisheries because, well, quite honestly, they're very good at it and can do it quickly. They have the specialized equipment for the net deployment and the platform placements that we utilize. They are also quite useful for helping us when deploying barrier nets in case there is any entanglement upon deployment to untangle those nets so they settle straight to the bottom. This is what the site looks like after it's complete. And I would like to walk you through then the events that occur. Animals are migrating from the east, which is at the bottom of the screen, towards the west. As they encounter the barrier net, they are guided towards the basin as opposed to around the island. The minke whales are very aware of the nets, and we see them navigate them very well. To the right, you see the fish farm, and there is a boat, rather large boat, that we utilize as part of the catch process. It has a line that is attached to it that goes to the seafloor, underneath the barrier nets, all the way to this other net that you see, which is tethered to the barrier or the guide net. This is the net door. So as a whale swims through and it gets into the basin, the boat then takes off, moving northward and pulling this net door shut. That net door then is secured by a smaller boat. People who are observers observe animals from atop a rock or an island. This also then is a great vantage point for them. Sorry, wrong one. This is also then a great vantage point for them to observe the whale once it enters the basin. The animal, after looking at the basin period, it does explore, as we've seen, even going in here looking for an exit. But once in this area, then we will move down to the facility with the door closed to begin procedures of the hearing test. Now, I noted that our first field effort was proof of concept, and it truly was to see if we could get the system to work to catch a whale. What we saw while we were there was that, based upon our observations, 20 whales swam through the region while we were there. This map shows a display of the animals as they were coming from the east, moving to the west, from their initial sighting to the east to their last sighting, moving west. 20 whales were seen moving through the region during this time, consisting of 19 minkies and 1 humpback whale. And these whales either swam through the basin, swam around the outside island if they were able to cut around the guide net, or in 1 or 2 cases actually went closer to shore and then around these islands. 6 whales entered the catch basin during the time period from the 11th to the 26th of June. This is the time where we called our catch phase, as it took us quite a while to get everything set up. 3 of these animals were in the basin prior to the time we were catch ready, but 3 came in once we were in catch mode beginning on the 11th. Now, 2 of those whales were caught, but again, this year we made no attempts to test any animals. What did we learn from that effort? Well, one, much of this effort or this project was based upon local knowledge of minke migrations, and there's always a risk in capitalizing on local knowledge. But it turns out that that local knowledge was very accurate, and that indeed the adolescent minke whales did swim through there fairly regularly. Based upon the number of animals that swam through the catch basin region, we predict in the years to come that we may have a chance for 1 or 2 catch opportunities per week. Now, that doesn't seem like much, but I want to point out that even 1 audiogram on a minke whale that captures its range of hearing and sensitivity will be an extremely useful piece of information for us in kind of predicting ocean noise impacts to these animals. We have learned that the whales exploring the basin may very well enter the fish farm of their own accord, and we're actually hoping that that will be the case. A change in strategy next year will be to have the fish farm door open at the time the animal is in the basin. Now, we've made a number of modifications to the system to make it more efficient, and all that has to happen based upon the experiences that we have had so far. So we're excited that we're getting ready to go into the next season. And our goal this year is to perform a hearing test on a minke whale. It's exciting to us because if we successfully perform a hearing test, it will be the first audiogram for any baleen whale. And it will provide that fundamental piece of information that we need to really start protecting better baleen whales from ocean noise by knowing the types of frequencies of sound that they hear and how sensitive they might be to them. This data that we get for the minke whale will probably be used then to extrapolate to other baleen whale species. And maybe that can be rightly criticized. They are not the same species. Certainly a blue whale is not a minke whale, but it may be a fairly decent proxy for something like a humpback whale, which is fairly vocal and has frequency ranges that expand probably up into ranges where we think minke whales might also hear. Furthermore, it's better to extrapolate from within the group than it is from without, because many ideas about what or how to treat impacts to the baleen whales occur now by extrapolation from other marine mammals, not the baleen whales. So in all, we think this information will be extremely useful in moving us forward and helping to better protections for all baleen whale species. This is a complicated effort, and it takes a big team of experienced people. This is not all of the individuals that are involved with the project, but these are the primary investigators involved. So I need to at least give them a shout out. Dr. Petter Kvadsham is from FFI in Norway, and he is the primary investigator on the project with me. Lars Kleven does much of the logistical work for us, has his own company called LK Arts. Jason Molsow is with me at the National Marine Mammal Foundation and has a background also in animal bioacoustics, particularly in hearing, as does James Frinderen, who works with us at the US Navy Marine Mammal Program. Dr. Jonas Thielman is at Aarhus University in Denmark and has the most experience working with the minke whales within nets. He was the one involved with the net catch I showed you earlier in the talk. And then Rolf Arnoldberg and Craig Harms are our two marine mammal veterinarians that are on site with us. We're particularly happy to have Craig Harms with us, who probably has more experience with big whales than any other veterinarian that I am aware of. So with that, I want to thank you. And I appreciate your time, and I am happy to open the floor to some questions.
Thanks, Dorian. We do have a couple of questions. I know you mentioned the veterinarians that will be in attendance. Hang on just a second, sorry. We got a question about how are you going to measure stress levels? And they also asked how many vets experienced in handling cetaceans will be in attendance.
So stress levels, you can do it behaviorally, assuming that there's a correlation between behavior and stress. There isn't always, but in this case, I think it's a reasonable assumption because we are handling wild animals. And wild animals, you can reasonably anticipate once grabbed or handled in any manner are going to elicit a classic stress response. That can be observed through cortisol, but that's not something that we can measure on the fly in the field. That was something we would have to look at after the fact from any blood samples that are collected. However, we can look at the respiration rate of the animals. Our respiration rate is a pretty good indicator of animals that are stressed, and it can go either way. They can either increase their respiration rate or they can decrease it dramatically as well. So we have our veterinarians on site for monitoring of that. We're also going to be monitoring the heart rates of the animals and looking for any abnormalities in it as we are watching the animal. Now, with regard to the experience of our marine mammal vets, our Norwegian vet has experience primarily with toothed whales as far as his experience with cetaceans. And then Craig Harms is our expert with the mysticetes whales. And Craig is sort of the lead for any sort of sedation/anesthesia for stranded large whales on the East Coast of the United States, and even teaches courses on that subject to veterinarians. So outside of Michael Moore, he's probably one of the two people that I can think of that probably has the most experience working with stranded whales of this size.
Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about the advisory committee that reviewed protocols and, address some of those concerns?
Well, we have two. We had an advisory committee. Well, it's our institutional animal care and use committee. They reviewed the project ahead of time. It also has marine mammal veterinarians that are on that group. They provide comment questions for us to clarify before they approve the protocol. That protocol then goes to the Bureau of Navy Medicine for anything that is funded by the Office of Naval Research. Their veterinarians also then have to review and approve. So it has gone through those routes, but in addition, we also fielded a team of veterinarians outside that deal more with stranded whales or involved with the development of whale anesthesiology. And that group was very informative to us in helping us guide our procedures and protocols as well.
We got a question about the whales that were captured during the first phase of the operation last year. Did you didn't tag them at any point, or you didn't tag them, right?
No. So there were 3 whales that swam into the basin. One of those whales was not observed until it was coming through the basin door. So it actually swam to the opposite side of the basin, found the barrier net, turned around and came back out before the door could be shut. So that animal effectively, it was caught in the sense it swam in the basin. It wasn't caught in the sense that it got out before the door was shut. The second animal was in the basin for 8 hours. Now we had a 12-hour observational period for the animals. And during that 12 hours, there are sufficient tidal cycle changes. The animal was able to explore and exploit an area where the net's lifted up on the high tide, and then get out about 8 hours into the observation period. That was one of our learning scenarios. Honestly, we now have an ROV that we deploy to make sure that all nets are down to the bottom as they should be throughout the tidal cycle. And then the last animal that came in was not actually a minke whale. It was a humpback whale adolescent that swam in. And once we realized it, we quickly opened the door and let it go. So it was technically caught, but it wasn't caught for very long before we released it. None of the animals were handled beyond just having them in the basin.
Okay, thanks for that. Got a technical question. Is the NIHL in marine mammals similar to that seen in humans, and in parentheses, high frequency loss?
So what we know about at least dolphins, I'll use those for the example, is that they do show high frequency hearing loss with age. So we would call that presbycusis, which is something that they share with humans. They can also show the same temporary loss in hearing due to noise exposure that has been seen. Now, sensitivity to that varies by species, so it's really hard to come up with a blanket statement to say that all of them would respond similarly. Some animals seem to be more robust to noise exposures than others when it comes to that. And I guess a good example of one that's very sensitive seems to be the harbor porpoises, which can show noise-induced hearing loss at relatively low levels compared to some of the other animals, such as sea lions or maybe bottlenose dolphins at certain frequencies.
Okay. We don't have any additional questions at the moment. Maybe we want to give people a minute or two. Is there anything you didn't touch on about the project or about your larger work that you wanted to mention?
Well, I think it's important to look at this as just one piece of the puzzle. The foundation is involved with a lot of acoustic research related to the hearing of marine mammals. including noise impacts from specific noise sources that are in the ocean, as well as getting basic information on the hearing capabilities of animals. These all are used to try and help guide regulatory processes and to be used as information that specifically goes into making environmental decisions about when noise sources are going to be problematic, when they need to be regulated or ruled out, and when they might be utilized without much concern for the impact they have. So it's kind of a comprehensive, broad approach that we have. But that fundamental piece is still the audiogram. So we believe it's critical to get that for at least one member that can be representative of the baleen whales.
Okay, and we got a question about how many years is this particular project going to last, and how many animals do you hope to test during that time?
The project is potentially slated to go 3 years from this point. So this field season and 2 more. That obviously is up to the funding agencies. They get to decide whether it moves forward or not. We have asked for a maximum of 12 whales over the 3-year period. We honestly think that's probably being very optimistic. Our hope is if we just get a handful of whales that we have a sufficient enough sample size, not only to see what the hearing curves look like, but to kind of start to get an understanding of the variability that might exist amongst individuals of that species and age group. And I need to point out, I think the fact that we're using adolescent whales is probably provides more protection, and I put that in quotes, because these are animals that will have the best hearing, presumably of the species, assuming that as animals age in that species, they will also start to lose hearing as in other mammals.
Another question about migration patterns. Is there any concern about affecting the migration patterns of the juvenile whales?
Well, from what we've seen, even the ones that were caught, once they turned around and went out, they just went back the barrier nets the way they, or the guide nets the way they came in, and went around them and continued on their migration. So we don't have any indication that it disrupted the migratory pattern. They seem pretty hard coded to make that kind of northwest trek along the coastline.
We got someone thanking you for the work you're doing and asking if the project is successful, how do you envision the information is going to be used, to actually protect whales?
I think the very first thing that's done is to look at let's put it in context of a particular project that involves ocean noise, is looking at the noise sources that would or would not be within that range of hearing for the animal. So which noise sources do we need to be concerned about and which ones we don't? The next step would to be looking at what are the levels of those noise sources, and what might the levels be that the animals receive as they're doing their thing in the environment. Comparing that then to their threshold of hearing, we may start to come up with some estimates based upon what we've observed in other animals about how they might respond, how they might be impacted with masking, how they might be affected physiologically. Now, that will be still some guesswork on our part, extrapolating from other species, but that fundamental piece of information is an important step in moving us in the right direction. Finally, at least in the United States, the way things are done now is that noise sources are weighted by a process or by a filter, basically called an auditory weighting function. That basically looks at what the animal's sensitivity is to certain levels of sound to try and determine when they encounter a sound, how impactful it might be. Those auditory weighting functions are based upon audiograms, and in part, they are based upon audiograms. And the fact of the matter is, right now, those weighting functions that exist for the larger whales, there's no audiogram upon which to base that work. So we have to extrapolate again from unrelated species. So in that regard, it'll be a useful step forward as well.
Quick question, are you testing both male and female animals?
We have no particular selection for one or the other.
Okay. If there have been no audiograms for baleen whales so far, what has the previous research been based on?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, the previous research.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Maybe Jenna, if you want to clarify, I can ask Dorian again. Any thought to collecting passive acoustic data during the capture and testing phases to see if there's a potential of any stress-related acoustic emissions from the subjects?
As an excellent question. In fact, we do. We have last season 2 passive monitors deployed. And it was one of our goals to see if we could even hear any sort of vocalization from the whales, but we recorded nothing. So the minke whales seem to be very quiet. Incidentally, there were some killer whales in the area on one of these recordings, which were very vocal. So the sense that the minke whale, being a prey item of the killer whale in an area where killer whales are prevalent, probably makes sense that the minke whales don't make a lot of their own sounds because they don't want to attract predators. But we will continue to utilize those monitors. And yes, there will be monitors, acoustic monitors deployed during the hearing test.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just catching up with the questions now. They're coming in pretty quickly. Can you talk a little bit more about the sedation protocol and when it would be used and how that would work?
Sure. So the sedation protocol was something that was come up with by a group of marine mammal veterinarians that have significant experience either with dealing with stranded misdeceit whales, baleen whales, or are involved with the development of anesthesia protocols for whales. That group met several times to talk about the best approach based upon prior experiences with sedation in the field on stranded animals. That protocol is meant to be used in a situation where animal movement is such that either the AEP procedure will be not capable of being performed because there's too much muscular activity, or that there is a potential risk to a human involved, because we do have to put sensors on and we do have to do those types of things. So it's sort of the next to the last resort. The last resort is just letting the animal go. And we don't intend on using it, but ultimately that decision is always going to be in the hands of the attending veterinarians that are on site with the animal, which is again why we're very happy to have Craig Harms there, given his level of experience with the misdeceit whales.
Another question about while you had the animals that you did have in the net, did you see a change in respiration rate and behavior?
Another great question. The answer is no, which was a little surprising. The average respiration rate was about 0.8 per minute. So, a little less than 1 respiration every minute. And that turned out to be the case when they were in the basin as well. So that was encouraging to us, that even though the basin was closed off, they didn't seem to be stressed by it. They just treated it more or less, so I've got a roadblock in my way and now I got to figure my way out.
Okay. Another question about how the project or the research might impact the whales after they leave. And the question is, would the stress impact a female's ability to reproduce?
Well, one of the things that we're going to do is put the satellite tags on so we can monitor them after they leave. One of our concerns was raised earlier. Do they continue on their migration going to the Arctic? So this allows us to address that. The question about the cortisol event and how that might affect reproduction is based at least upon what we know with the smaller cetaceans. Cortisol increases occur during the stressor and they drop rapidly once the stressor is removed. And if you have interest, I have a paper with my postdoc, Dr. Corey Champagne, that was put out in 2018 that looks at this exact thing, performing stress tests in smaller animals. So based upon what we see in those toothed whales, if they respond similarly, the cortisol should not be elevated to the extent that you would kind of see those types of long-term chronic effects that would impact reproduction.
Okay. I might also mention, as we're starting to run out of time here, that if people want to learn more about the project, they can go to the National Marine Mammal Foundation's website, which is nmmf.org. And that's also a good way to contact us if you have any specific questions that didn't get answered.
And I would like to, Steve, let me add to that, that I try to be pretty responsive to questions when they come in. So please feel free to use that form if you have a question.
Okay. Okay. We get this question about entanglement. In Scotland, where entanglement in crab or prawn pot lines is very common in minke whales, the whales spin and further entangle themselves. Do you anticipate similar adverse reactions to being restrained?
No, I don't. And I don't think it'd be very difficult for them to entangle themselves in the nets the way they're pulled up underneath. The point I think there is appropriately made. It tends to be these single lines that animals get entangled around their flukes that they generally get entangled in. The nets we're using for the barrier nets extend to the seafloor. They are one continuous piece that go down about 40 meters. I think it'd be very difficult for these animals to get entangled in that. The fact of the matter is, when we watch them, they're very aware of the nets. So they are able to maneuver around them pretty seamlessly. Once the animal is inside the fish farm, that's a very controlled pull, pulling the net underneath. It's similar to the way that it's done at facilities that have netted enclosures for smaller whales. So we're pretty confident in there that it'd be very difficult for the animal to get anything wrapped around itself, given the control that we have over the nets.
This is a question for me, but I know as we've been talking about it, do you want to talk a little bit about the conditions in this sort of part of the world and how that can be difficult to do this research?
It's the Arctic in the summer, so it can be like San Diego weather, sunny in the mid 70s, and then a couple of hours later, it can be rainy, cold, and the wind blowing pretty hard. Weather conditions are something that we have to deal with. So, I mean, beyond a certain point, we know that we can't do testing, so we wouldn't even attempt it. So part of this project really relies on patience. There's a lot of sitting, there's a lot of waiting, and there's a lot of hoping that all the weather conditions remain good.
You mentioned some misinformation that's been out there last year. We got a question about the funding behind this and objectivity. And, I think that there was some misinformation that this is being funded by oil and gas interests, that sort of thing. Do you want to kind of address that?
Yeah, that one I think is maybe confusion about the agency. One of the funding agencies is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and they are responsible for regulating the oil industry. Their interest in having this information is so that they can better do that job. Right now, they will have to make decisions again based upon extrapolations from other species. So they do have a vested interest in gathering the information. The other funding agencies include NOAA, which is also a regulator of impacts to marine mammals. Same reasons as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. They would like to have this information so that they can better regulate noise impacts to marine mammals. Marine Mammal Commission is sort of an advisory group. They have also seen the importance of this and had recommended that this be done, supporting the National Academy's recommendation that we acquire hearing information on these large whales. And then the other two, which probably also get called out as being biased, are the Office of Naval Research and Navy Living Marine Resources. Much like the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, they don't regulate the sound, but they also understand that the more they know about what these animals hear, the better position they'll be in to be able to respond to and honestly deal with regulators about the potential impacts to the animals. So in this case, I think there's always a concern about bias, but all this information is going to be open in the literature. It'll be available for people to look at and make their own decisions upon. I guess I can leave it at that.
Okay. We're pretty much running out of time. Any final thoughts, Dorian?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for showing up, and I hope you share our concern about wild marine mammals and the potential impact that we as human beings can have upon them. If we're the cause of the problem, then we should also be searching for ways to minimize the impact that we have. So I'm assuming that you have interest in that group. So thank you for being here, and hopefully together we can all go out there and have a positive impact. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We appreciate it. Have a good day.